Greetings and welcome to another episode of Safety is Redacted. Today I am joined by the incomparable Rob Lewington. What do folks need to know about you if they don't already know it? What makes you such a wonderful person in this space?
Well, I don't know. Being a wonderful person in this space is potentially debatable, but I'll give you the best version. I was saying to Matt a second ago, like, often in these sort of things, you're doing a panel or you're doing whatever, and you give people the really sort of potted history, but, just to expand a little bit more, because we have the benefit of a long form content here in podcasting. I mean, I think one of the things I'm proudest of is worked in trust and safety for, I think it's about 17 years now. I started right at the sort of entry level as a moderator in a what you would now probably call a metaverse kind of a game. Maybe that word's going to change soon, but let's call it that. And you clicking the buttons and using the tools and all that sort of stuff. And I've held, I think, most of the sort of non-engineering sort of positions that you can hold. I set up again what you would now call law enforcement response team, which we didn't call at the time. We were just trying to figure out problems. And I've led operations and moderation teams and sort of worked with product teams. And I mean, part of why we're connected, obviously, is that I've been working in the video games field and on the periphery of that for a long time. I was at PlayStation for 10 years. And then more recently, I've been VP of what you call customer trust at Twitch, and still in that sort of gaming adjacent sort of ecosystem, working with TIGG and previously Fair Play Alliance and things like that. So really pleased to have, gone through all these things, and hopefully, I don't want to use the word wonderful that you use, Matt, but hopefully it gives me some sort of perspective on this.
Yeah, if you get tagged with it, sometimes you just got to run with it.
Yeah, that's right. I want to go with it.
No, you highlight something that is very fascinating to me about our industry at this point, maturity that we've hit, where, people could have started where you're at on the very low level, like, oh, we do need moderation or community management, to now, see it in almost like leadership position about policy and framework thinking and best practices to a degree that almost every industry has a chance to develop with given enough time.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, I'll go back to, I was doing a panel again in 2019 in DC, and there was a keynote speaker, a guy called Tarleton Gillespie, who I think was at Microsoft, and he has a great book on moderation. He was talking at the time, and this is sort of 6 years ago now, about the need to professionalize the profession and to sort of formalize it a bit more. And I think we're starting to see that happen, right, with folks like TIGG, but also just the Safety Professional Association and all that sort of stuff. So I think, as you say, we're starting to develop those sort of best practices and come together and work together. And that's what's really exciting.
No, and to see, the growth in just a short amount of time. I know TSPA has been around a few years now, and to see how much their conferences has grown and the resources in that, just collecting the history of, online safety in general, and just formalize that industry, it makes it so much easier, particularly for anyone new coming into the space, can be like, oh, this problem's been solved. Like, I loved your law enforcement response reference. No one called it that then, but they knew there was a need. And now if you go to a small to medium or even a large platform, for sure, if you don't have an alert team, everyone's just like, how do you not have this? Like, it's so standard. It's incredible.
And funnily enough, little anecdote, I remember my VP at the time coming and, like, we didn't know what to call it. He came and sat by my desk and he goes, what are we going to call this? And we were like just riffing on stuff. We ended up calling it something completely different than law enforcement response. But it's nice, again, to your point, nice we now have these sorts of terms that pretty much everybody uses, and therefore you compare apples with apples, and I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, and I will say the funny part about that story to me is we all know the thing that's needed, but naming the thing always seems to be the hardest part. You're like, wait, we just spent an hour talking about what?
Yeah, once you got the name and the logo, you sort it.
It's easy after that. Everything else is easy. Wait, well, we're here to talk about a unique topic. I know you've been, TIGG, formerly Fair Play Alliance, you've been an advisor for a while, you've been in gaming for a bit, and one of the ideas I want to dive into that we do talk about a lot and get into the weeds, so to speak, is just thriving in games. What is it? What does it look like? What could it look like? Particularly you've been on a few different sides of it, from publishing to the safety aspect. So I'd love to get your insights on what is thriving in gaming and how can platforms start to think about it, or what are steps that we can take to make sure that our players can thrive, even our developers can thrive as well, right? And really promote this ecosystem.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I'll give a little bit of a plug up front because I think it also helps frame what I'm going to say to Matt's sort of back catalog in. I guess we're going to all saying safety is redacted, right? Safety is sexy,
That,
whatever you want to call it. And you know, I was digging in, and I'd worked with West Hart for years, and had him speak a lot. But he gave a great, you know, overview of a lot of this in your last episode, really focusing on the player dynamics perspective. And he knows so much more than I do about anything related to that. So I'm not going to dig in there. But my sort of background, I guess, a little bit different. And I really sort of content moderation, you know, operational, trust and safety perspective. And again, you know, you and I met last time we saw each other was at a panel in San Francisco, and I was on the panel with Samantha from Discord, and she said something which I think framed what I think about this in a better, pithier way than I had ever done. But she said basically like safety is a prerequisite for driving, which I really like, right? Because like the thriving part is super cool. And maybe if I use an analogy, if you think about a roller coaster, you know, you can have obviously the best, most fun roller coaster in the world, but you need to be safe, or else no one's going to ride on your roller coaster. At the same time, and to stretch this analogy really kind of works. At the same time, if you've stripped out all the fun from your roller coaster by making it big, that's not going to be any good either, right?
yeah.
But I do think that kind of, you know, safety is a prerequisite for driving is a really good way of framing it, because you can't skip right over safety, and you know, that's not a solved problem, right? So we also need to work on that as well to get us to the driving part. And you know, I mean, I'll say, I guess a couple of things throughout my career that I've sort of done a lot of research and studying on. If you really sort of boil down, like, you know, from a statistical perspective, you know, all the what we consider maybe unsafe experiences on a service, really statistically in most services, I think would probably find this if they did the research. Very few people ever have an unsafe experience, right? Like actually the interactions you have almost all the time. I can imagine, you know, most of the time I use any of these games or services, whatever, totally fine. I never even think about anything to do with safety. There's worth keeping that perspective in mind. At the same time, also in previous roles, I've done, you know, research where we find that the perception of that safety can, or lack thereof, can prevent people using, let's say, voice comms in a game. Because I know I never, you know, had an unsafe experience of, you know, in voice comms where this sort of classic, you know, teenager shouting at me and calling me a bad word has happened to me. It's never actually happened to me, but I have that stigma in my head, right? So again, even if you haven't experienced it yourself, I think it's very important. You do that. I mean, I don't know. I could go a little bit further. I have another thing, but what do you think of driving?
Yeah, I think any, you know, particularly in games, Wes had a great definition in that episode, but like if we talked about this a lot with him, like if you're playing a game, you're getting better at something, you're having positive interactions, social interactions with other players, and you're improving, right, within that experience. And it generally gives you something, ideally, intrinsically, a reward for leveling up and improving on all these experiences. Like that's the ideal. The challenge becomes the player dynamics piece, and the part I think we have struggled with is how do we make sure that social interaction, that's the toughest part. So from a thriving standpoint, that's why I think we need to look at that aspect to it. And it's one layer of many. But how do we facilitate those interactions? So, you know, we do feel good about, you know, when we teamed up with another player and we're accomplishing a goal together, or we're going through an experience together, even just passing each other in a world. There's a lot of ways I think to make that very positive. And then, you know, the flip side of that is, you know, that I will kind of talk to, but then we have to think about, you know, what do the ticketing things on the back end? How are we detecting sort of these bad actor behaviors when it does happen? How are we responding to reports when they come in? And ideally, if we can have a more positive social interaction environment, that thriving piece comes in, then we have fewer tickets and incidents on the back end, right? And so for me, is like, how do we reduce the overall amount of harms that we have to investigate and are present in these spaces? Is one aspect. Another side of it is how do we ensure that the overall experiences are good for all players as much as possible, so we have few of those harmful experiences.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And again, another thing I'll sort of riff on something that the West said, it got me thinking, right? And he was talking about, I'm afraid I forget the game that he was referencing, but he was talking about There was a game that did a GDC panel. And I know, TIGG and TSPA has always had that GDC track, which I think has been great throughout the years. So if anyone doesn't know about that, I think that's super cool. But he was talking about this specific game and how they put friction in the messaging component of the game, right? Well, that was really interesting because one of the things that got me thinking about is how there's kind of an advantage for games when it comes to safety versus a purely social platform. Now, of course, there are some additional challenges as well. Often it's much richer and you're creating levels that's slightly more complicated than just text chat. But the advantage, which I think is always good to see the positive side, is that, let's say you're doing a social app. You can't put friction in the messaging component because that's the feature.
That's 100%.
Right. So if you put that in, you kind of ruin it. If you're doing WhatsApp, can't say, you can't message anyone on WhatsApp. That would be pointless. But for games, in the social part of it is, mechanism to help people engage with the game and enjoy the game more. It's not an end of itself and the enjoyment of the game too. In that case, I thought it was a really interesting example where, in that case, a video game can kind of say, well, do you know each other? And, how do you interact in a positive way before you start talking to each other? And so I thought that was very interesting. And I mean, again, I go back a little way in my career. I think this is a real example. Your memory kind of gets hazy, sort of about 15 years down the road. But I seem to remember working with a developer, and I think it was a poker game or something, and they were trying to create a sort of, they created this great game, and they said, we'll put some text chat in at the end. And we're sort of like, well, as the person sort of representing safety, I was going to say, well, you can do that. You're going to do all these things to make it safe. You've built all these functions. You're going to have filtering. You're going to have reporting. You're going to feed into these APIs with this, tooling that you're going to pull. You could not, and usually it's better to make the thing safe than to drop it altogether. But if it's an afterthought, then, maybe you just have the text chat. And, we also thought of other ways you could do it because it was part of a larger ecosystem where they could plug into APIs and whatever. And that made it a lot better. But I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing. At the end of the day, you want the people to play the poker and that's the most important thing in that.
But yeah, there's two things you hit on there. One is, hey, we made this great experience. Let's add text chat at the final stage. And it's like, okay, like if people, and that's where, I think one of the rules we share, like 80% of problems are caused by 5% of users, right? 5% of players. And that, I do believe that's fairly true across the industry. Intentionally, I had a bad day, cheating, whatever. It's fun when I play with my son. I will play a game and other people start messaging like, oh, you're pay to win, this or that. And he'll have a response and I'll be like, oh, Dad, they're using bad words. Should I report them? I'm like, hey, if you feel threatened, like, sure, like you should. And so we'll have those conversations, which is good, but it's the afterthought, right? Of like, oh, we should add this. The other unique thing about games that you kind of alluded to is the fact that it's an experience and it's becoming much more social. And that is something I think is very unique as we look at online experiences evolve. I really think that the growth of experiences and social are going to emerge more naturally over the next 5 to 10 years. And that's going to me, I see that as the evolution of social, not just that we're, sharing holiday photos or, family trips or things that are what we had for breakfast. Is going to be that we played this thing and I want to talk to other people about this thing. And I want to share with people that I'm doing whatever XYZ online. And I want others who enjoy that as well to come be part of it.
No, great. I love that vision.
Nice. Well, as we move forward, I mean, there's been a lot of evolution, which you've kind of touched on, and what safe looks like and what thriving looks like. But one of the things that is really pushing stuff forward seems to be this move towards compliance and tech. And that's been a big focus lately. So as we start to look at compliance, how is that really driving the trust and safety narrative?
Yeah, and it's really interesting. And I'm going to reference, again, here I am, I'm just referencing out things other people said, but I mean, so many great people talking about this space at the moment. And yet, going back, let's say 15 years, I would never have dreamt. In fact, it's not true. I always thought people should be more attention to trust and safety. But at the time, it was very difficult to get everyone.
Yep.
And now you get so many voices, which is great. I mean, one of the sort of narratives I hear in this space, and this is not specific to video games, and probably less video games, but you hear about this sort of trust and safety teams becoming more compliance-driven functions. And there's a fantastic article by Deputy Keller on lawfare. It's called The Rise of the Compliance Speech Platform. And essentially what she said, and I'm just reading this verbatim, is that content moderation is becoming a compliance function with trust and safety operations run like factories, audited like investment banks. Absolutely. I think, she makes a fantastic point. I think there's nothing I would dispute about that. I guess what I would say on the one hand is I had an instant sort of visceral reaction as somebody who, works day in, day out doing this, where I was like, wait a minute, that's not true. Because I think when you work in trust and safety, you spend so much of your time thinking about your users or your players or your customers or however you want to think about them. And really most of your time is spent thinking in that sense, like, how can we actually get the right outcomes for our customers? So on that side of it, she's totally right that there is a requirement to do the compliance part. But I think, a lot of professionals in the industry, going back to that sort of formalizing the profession conversation we were having before, a lot of the professionals in this space generally will probably think about the right outcomes for their customers. So there is that. And then the other part that I thought was sort of, I guess I just come at from a different angle. And I also, I tend to be an optimist and a sort of glass half full person who's sort of interested in the creativity and the sort of fun things that we can do rather than the sort of the downsides. So that might be biasing my thinking a little bit, but a different sort of take that I'll take is that's all sort of oriented around speech. And again, I think a lot of the time, the sort of legal and First Amendment sort of, American sort of view on this, and maybe me coming from Europe, I have a slightly different view, is I tend to think about it less like speech and more, from a business perspective, right? And I guess my analogy, different from some services are like a town square. I know you have experience of that kind of, service, but, a lot of things are, more about entertainment. And I tend to use the analogy of, I'll call it a cinema, you might call it a movie theater in the US, where, on the one hand, you have, the entertainment that you're trying to give to your patrons, if you like, and you've got to make sure what you're putting on the screen is, rated correctly and, available to the right audience, and you're not serving, an X-rated 18 plus content to younger audiences, and you have that sort of thing. But then you're thinking about the audience themselves and how they interact. It is perfectly normal for, a business to not allow somebody in a movie theater, not even the content of their speech, or it can be even just the volume of their speech, right? If you're in a movie theater and you're speaking loudly and you're disrupting the enjoyment of the service for everyone else, well, they have the right to kick you out and take you out there because it ruins their business because other people there are not enjoying, right? Again, that kind of goes back to that, what we're doing and why we're doing. So all of that, it's just a different way to think about the compliance part. But I do think what I think is very true, and again, go back into my past working in these things from a long time ago, and particularly in video games, we often used to say to ourselves, well, we have a corporate responsibility to do the right thing here. And part of the reason that we're doing that is because if we don't do it right, maybe regulators will come in and tell us you've got to do X plus Y. And, that may not always be the best thing. I think, unfortunately, we've got to that point where clearly regulators felt they had to do those sort of things. And I'll stop there because, again, I'm keen to get your take on that. But I think we can go in lots of different ways there.
No, there's a lot of different ways. It definitely impacts the business narrative or imperative. We saw this with, Twitter from 2016 to roughly 2020 when they made some very strong policy choices and what that led on the platform. And then Elon taking over, and then that, shift to blue sky. And even now, it's hard to talk about moderation in general without hearing who's making the rules? And having that speech just become politicized, which I think has been a challenge for a lot of platforms. What do we allow versus not allow? And I know my first experience of this came as a teacher working with teenagers, and particularly teenagers in the US. You heard this a lot. It's always freedom of speech, right? And I know the movie theater example is a good one because there's a notorious case, like you can't yell fire in a movie theater. And, some people get hurt in a stampede or other stuff. Like this is all stuff, things that have been documented. And so there's a lot of cases, that we use in ed code and ed law when taking discipline on students in schools. And so, like, yes, you have freedom of speech, but you don't have freedom of consequence. And when does something you say become disruptive to the learning process versus, something that is actually your free speech ability to express that? And those are things that are constantly in flux in education. And as I look at online, for so long, a lot of moderation and I think terms of service enforcement has been so focused on here's everything you can't do. And here's, if you do these things, here are the things we're going to do with them, versus what I've seen successfully in the real world. And I've seen language change in terms of service that we present public facing is it's been more of here's what you can do here. And here's how you can engage with this community. And particularly in games, whether it's an NPC or another player, as we think about, trying to match players appropriately, who can show someone how to play the game, who can create opportunities and interactions to be like, oh, this is how I heal other players, and we do this in this game. Oh, this is how we discover stuff. Oh, I need help. I can call on a more experienced player to come and assist me to overcome this challenge that I cannot do on my own. And I think more of that is being incorporated in that we see as just these positive interactions, which I know works with humans. So to see that reflected in tech, so it's less about let's take away down all the stuff to keep people from being safe, but let's also build the mechanics to show people what they can do and how to have this. And ultimately, I think it builds more resiliency and it builds more agency to try and resolve these things on their own versus consistently, well, this doesn't work and I don't like this experience. Let me block and report this thing, or the system should just take it down, or I'm just not going to play anymore, right? Like those are all sort of evolutions I've seen in the safety space that have been incredibly positive, especially if you start thinking about compliance and free speech. Like those are going to be hard because you got who's government and is it regulated? I love it when it's just like even Canada's calling for free speech. Canada doesn't have free speech. That's America. Their freedom of expression slightly different. For me, I just like I don't like getting bogged down in that part of the conversation because I don't have enough law degrees to comment. But I do think as a platform designing like, well, what is it we want people to actually do here? And let's start designing for that. And then we'll kind of build things around it.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And again, one of the directions that I thought we could go in that conversation is, you've got that. So that's the stick, right? And
yes.
Again, when with often, I'm sure you've done this as well, and you're coming up with enforcement mechanisms for users. You want to have a carrot and a stick. We sometimes say, well, it's not enough to just ban people, but we need to, drive it.
And the stick's important, right? Because if you don't enforce rules consistently, your audience is going to turn on you then too, because they'll know, like, oh, well, they're not consistent. Like, let me do what I want, and yeah, we'll get away with something.
100%. And there's lots of good data, that companies have done. In fact, I've even seen shared through when it was the Third Player Alliance some great data around recidivism, where different interventions can be more successful at preventing recidivism than others. And I completely agree with you. And at the same time, you want to incentivize people to thrive and to do fun things, to work with each other and make it more enjoyable. And I kind of wonder, this is kind of my sort of deep-seated sort of thought that I've had for many years, but I wonder what you think about it, is whether you create the carrot as well in the industry. Because I guess to give you my kind of big high-level thought on this, we often talk about, and I really like, one of the things I love about trust and safety, again, going back to things like the TSPA and things like that, is how collaborative it is as a space, right? And there's very few sort of, trade secrets. You will usually get, on board with somebody from another company and say, well, how do you solve this problem? And they say, oh, we do it this way. And you're very open and collaborative and things like that, which I think is a positive. I think the potential drawback, the slightly maybe controversial take that I have is the drawback can be, we exist within an economic, landscape, which is inherently competitive. It's a capitalist society, and, therefore companies are competitive. And you hear, for example, large CEOs of big companies who invested a lot in this space who are saying, well, we only ever get negative. Like, we put all this money into it, we're only getting every negative. What is the point in doing all this positive? And you've sort of seen them sort of bring back, and there's a lot of focus on, again, the speech component and the rules. But you've also seen companies roll back proactive detection mechanisms. Yep. Like, we do all this work, create all these models, and what's the point? No one's ever giving us any praise for it. And the thing that I wonder about, and again, keen to get your take on, is can we create a cap? Can we create more rewards for companies who are doing good things? What do you think?
Yeah, I would love to see that. I definitely think it can exist, right? As we look at, what mechanics are being introduced, like we'll focus on games. Are you deploying these certain types of mechanics? Are you looking at these interactions, or even around, the transparency reports? It's hard to advocate like, oh, we reduced this harm by 2%. But if you have 100 million monthly active users, like 2% is like a tiny dent in that problem. We're like, well, you only solved this problem. Like, but if we put 2%, that's pretty big. Like, those are the type of increments of improvement we see in our space. And so anything we can do to actively recognize something good, whatever that is, I think then gives us a benefit to actually focus on what needs to be changed or improved. And that's the hard part. Like something you hit on earlier that I totally resonates with trust and safety is how much this group cares, like to a fault. And it's not that, I'm doing my job, but I'm doing something I really care about. If I'm a social worker, I'm an educator, like these are people who love people and want good experiences to happen. And so within safety and gaming, then it becomes, if all you see in the headlines, if all you see at congressional hearings or other stuff is all the bad things that are happening with zero recognition of the good stuff, it becomes very personal. And I've seen professionals take it as personal, and it's like, no, like it's not you. You've done good stuff. It's just they're frustrated with these things that continue to need to get better. And I think it's easy, to kind of pick on that. I always think about like the early Simpsons episode where Bart gets a fake tattoo and Lisa's there poking his arm, and he's like, "Oh, quit it." She keeps poking, "Oh, quit it." And like that's what it feels like some days, where you're just completely just getting hit and knocked down with all the stuff that hasn't been fixed yet. And I mean, you mentioned 17 years. That's a blink, and we're trying to compound a couple hundred years of policy into 15 to 20 years worth of technology. And that type of growth and evolution, like it does take time, not making an excuse for any of it, but really, how do we start to give a little bit of recognition so that way we can advocate for, oh, well, this group improved by 2% by doing this thing. If other trust and safety teams adopted this principle, they can have that same impact. What else are the people doing? And we can slowly start to see the industry as a whole level up.
Yeah. And I mean, even to again, riff on your point about the blink of an eye, I mean, think about the, tens of thousands of years of human existence where we've developed, these mechanisms to how we work with each other and how we thrive in real life. Right. It tends to be, again, we talked about on a panel recently, like, this sort of analogy that somebody was using about being in a pub, which again resonates to me when you're going to start talking about pubs, my attention. But the things.
Who doesn't love a good pub?
Right. I know. You like pubs in Southern California. But anyway, the analogy that was used, and I'm afraid I can't attribute the post because I can't remember who it was, but it was a great post. And they're talking about, you have this crowd of people who are talking too loudly, and, the people at the next table move their chairs back. And they diffuse the situation with this very subtle, people sort of, probably subconscious, human interaction. And, there was, at the table, again, the example was they're talking about football and it's getting a little bit out of hand. And one of the people jumps in and says, "Hey, what's the next drink?" And suddenly that's all forgotten. And these really sort of subtle parts of human existence can make such a difference.
I lived through one of those. I was working in Stanford. It was back when I was still coaching basketball. And it's in the summer. We're doing summer camps. There's a bunch of coaches. We're all in our early 20s. Still working out. So I think like, oh, it's like so young and beautiful back then. But we see this bus pull up and just these large humans get off, and come to find out it's the Australian national rugby team is in town for a match. For whatever reason, they're staying in Palo Alto, and they're all coming to the same bar that we're at, just hanging out between camps. And so one of my friends was having a little too much fun and starts talking trash to one of the rugby players. Sometimes you could tell when a fight's going to start, but this is a moment when I could see how it was going to end and none of it was good. And so it's that same moment you jump in and you just diffuse the situation. Thinking from that contextual example, like weaving that into what does that look like online? Like how can we empower players and others to diffuse that before it escalates into something that it doesn't need to be? And I think those are great analogies to pull in. I think the challenge then comes is how do we do that at scale, which always seems to be the very next question. And I think that's something that this industry is actively working to try and solve.
And that's why I love this idea of rewarding. Because again, if you think about I'll use two examples, actually. I've used enough analogies. But two actual practical examples that I think could be, relative to this. One is, if you think about brand safety, specifically for advertisers, there are mechanisms that exist for brand safety certification where you can go through a kind of an audit, if you like, and then these companies will say, hey, we have certified that this company has the right mechanisms in place, and, advertisers can see that and they can gain some trust. Can you do that in such a way that users can feel some trust and can sort of feel as if this is a certified game that is at least doing the right things and, has a certain standard that they can expect. Another one, if you think about sort of customer service, is another good one. You see awards for customer service where, somebody may have tried an innovative approach and, you get these sort of things. And that can be a differentiator. I know certainly in the UK, when I was deciding between, different internet services providers, I won't use any names, but I remember thinking, well, if one of them could give me good customer service, I would definitely go with it. Fortunately, none of them did. I would certainly go with one of them. And again, I think, again, to use some concrete sort of examples, I would suggest that something like this, it doesn't necessarily have to be that they have done a brilliant job and a perfect job, but maybe they tried something innovative and they shared in a sort of private space like TIGG or something, some data about what in fact they tried and it didn't work. So let's say they tried some of those, human-based, interactive sort of wheelchair back, examples for, an online space. And here's what we found. And, again, that nature of trying those things can encourage companies to go beyond just sheer compliance and do something that helps thriving and maybe helps everybody sort of along the way because they learn what either works or what doesn't work. And so I love that kind of idea of being a little bit more incentivizing.
No, and something you hit on, I think that really helps solving problems at scale is all of those solutions really define a process. And that's something I think that can help as we particularly start to automate some of this thinking. Now, granted, we need to review data and reflect and check all the metrics, but having a clear process for what goes up versus what comes down, or how do we investigate, or how do we evaluate data, or what research we need to conduct. When those processes are in place, it streamlines everything and makes it so much easier. So like you said, to be able then to start to share more broadly about how we can look at these bigger issues and solve them in a way that makes sense, particularly with just when you have such a large player base, wherever you're at, how many people are online today, in the millions, if not billions, and just trying to make that as easy as possible and efficient as possible.
Yeah, 100%. You used the word metrics. And so anybody who knows...
we love metrics.
Well, exactly. And anybody who knows me and has worked with me will probably see the light bulb in my head go off because they know metrics is, it's a key word for me. I love data and I love to be sort of, empirical about, and I think, again, it was interesting last time in your last episode with Rest, he sort of, talked about the sort of academic side of it. I think he and Kim and other folks on the board of TIGG are fantastic about that approach. And he said something along the lines of some people need hard data. And I was thinking, well, that's me. I'm that sort of person. And I think there are ways to think about this, right? Like, again, to use them specific examples, I like to think about input and output. Right. And so, the sort of to flesh that out a bit, the sort of standard kind of input metrics that trust and safety operations teams sometimes work on things like, what's your service level agreement delay? How often are you hitting that? Or what's your response time? Or what's your quality assurance? And how often are you actually following the process properly? And all this sort of stuff. And that's great. And that's the stuff you can control. That's the input you're putting into the system. But I think it would be great also to start developing output. What is the output of all that? And if you think about, again, a simple example, something like customer satisfaction, DSAT in, customer service, like, you're doing all the inputs, you're making sure your agents are in principle following the right process and responding to the customer quickly and giving them the right things. But at the end of the day, how satisfied was the customer with? Again, I think this is potentially a great moment where AI can help with this. And again, something I just sort of sketched out in advance is for thriving. Could you, for example, safety, given we were saying safety is a prerequisite, but not an achievable goal, how can we show and quantify that, the positives? Again, we're not going to get 100% positive driving interactions, we know we're going to get some that are not good, right? So how do we quantify that? And so they say, well, the positive of being in game massively outweighs the negative. And again, I was sort of thinking, well, simple example, can you sample, let's say, voice comms or text chat, can you sample a representative sample of those interactions and use it and allow them to translate it into, you can take the sentiment and say, well, was this a positive? Was there somebody helping somebody to drive, or was it, a more negative thing? And you can sort of quantify that and see how the actions you're taking, let's say through player dynamics or any of those other things, any of those other interventions, are we pushing the needle on that? And again, some of that will be outside of your control, and some will be noise, and there will be things that are influenced by other factors that have nothing to do with it. So it's not a completely controllable metric, but it's an indicator of, is the output of all the stuff that working and help people thrive. So I think there's some interesting areas that the industry can.
No, that's where I start to get excited. We know that if we make it too safe, people are just not going to play, right? There's too much friction. It's not it isn't a satisfying gaming experience, right? So that's on the one end. On the other side of it, like something you hit on, I have this dream goal of a community health metric, which is going to be multiple points of data, right? Especially if we can start to connect, player drop off. We can call that churn. The churn is one of the few words. There's a handful of words out there. Churn is one, where it's almost like a grenade, like just drop it in a marketing meeting and walk out, and then just let everyone argue over what it means. But as we look at player retention, as we look at experience and playtime and interaction and, continued play, like there's all these other factors we can start to measure and correlate that with like tickets and infractions and nudges. And, where I'm cautious is when you get like 1 point of data where Xbox shared last year at the UK Safety Summit about how they were using nudges and voice chat, and they had 80% reduction in recidivism because they use nudges and voice chat, which is a brilliant metric. But that in and of itself is not going to change behavior across the board. And so, but that metric in combination with all the stuff that you talked about then starts to paint a bigger picture of like, okay, here are the things that we know that are helping. Here are the things we know that need to be improved. And here's how we can look at the overall makeup of our community in this space and how they're feeling and interacting. And that's where I hope we can evolve to a point, is you're talking about data, like what are those metrics that we can sort of create this word cloud around, or this data cloud, so to speak, and then start to point at these 6 factors, 7 factors, 10 factors based upon the gaming experience. That if we have these 5 to 10 things, we know that our community is overall healthy, and, we can point to some other outcomes from that. And that's where I think data can be exciting. We can have a lot of fun with it.
I think we can't let perfect enemy of good, right?
Yes, absolutely.
There's correlation and there's causation, and it may or may not be that we have to be careful about how we attribute, outcomes of things to these things. But at the end of the day, it's better to have some information than to not know, like whether or not right.
And that's the fascinating part of it too, is like humans are going to human. And when you put a game out there, like you're going to see, like your community is going to develop solutions to challenges you never thought of, or they're going to use your game in a way that you've never thought of. And that's one of the most fascinating things to me that I've seen as games come out and evolve, and we see behavior like Helldiver 2. We're seeing a lot of prosocial behaviors form naturally in that environment. There's still challenges, but to see those behaviors emerge completely on their own without any prompting, measurement, or anything, it's just fascinating to see that evolution as humans look to evolve or adapt experiences to prove them for themselves.
Yeah. And take that example, for example. So say you've got that metric that I talked about, and you see a positive uptick in it, and you're like, what the hell was that? We didn't even do anything.
Yep.
This moment, again, more than ever before, you could probably interrogate those interactions, ask, an LLM, complete what has changed and what is the difference, and you can see those interactions. In the past, that would have been so manual thing to do, but now we need to unlock the tools to be able to understand it so much better. So I think it's
No, just the potential level of efficiency that we can get from utilizing AI. That what is this behavior? How do we measure it? What are some potential things just to kind of streamline and speed up our own thinking as we respond to stuff? There's fascinating potential there.
100%.
Yeah. Well, hey, Rob, if folks need to find you, get a hold of you, ask you questions, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, and I thought about that ahead of time. I was thinking probably it shows you that I'm not plugged into thinking about these things. But I think, LinkedIn probably the best way. I'm on LinkedIn. I mean, I think because of the nature of what I do, I'm a fairly private profile, but if you work in the space, feel free to, connect with me, and, we can certainly connect and discuss. And so, LinkedIn, I think, is probably the best one.
Awesome. No, thanks, Rob. Appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge and having the conversation. Next time we should do this in a pub.
You're on. You're speaking my language again. So appreciate it. Thank you, Matt.
I love it. We're all about making dreams come true here at Safety is Redacted. So we'll work on that one. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a wonderful day.